Good morning, everyone. This is Darlene with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
And this is Sara Krall with End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin.
And we have Peter here with us this morning as well to help out with any technical difficulties that we may have. So if anybody has any issues that they're encountering, go ahead and type that into your chat box. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We're going to just go through this webinar and let everyone know what to expect from the CCR Toolkit that Sara and I have been working on to roll out to each of you. And I'm going to defer most of the speaking today to Sara. I'm not feeling 100% this morning, and so she has graciously accepted that duty. And we have some polling questions that we'll be asking you throughout today's presentation as well. And we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay, so first of all, we'd like to acknowledge the funding that allowed us to work on the CCR Toolkit, which was from the Wisconsin Department of Justice, the Stop Violence Against Women Act Formula Grant Program. So thank you for providing us the opportunity to update this information and get it all out to the group. Just a little bit about the flow of the webinar. We have a slide for each section of the toolkit. So the flow of the webinar is going to follow the flow of the toolkit precisely. So we'll give you a glimpse into the content and provide you with the link for accessing the toolkit later today, as well as send out the webinar recording. So the very first page of the toolkit is an introduction to the toolkit about sort of the sections that are included, as well as what our intention is for providing this resource to CCR teams. So there are four main segments of the toolkit. We have laying the groundwork, establishing a coordinated community response, CCR activities, and state and national resources. And just a little bit about the goal for providing this toolkit. We're hoping that we're sharing concise and relevant information that will contribute to Wisconsin CCR team's success and sustainability. And we hope that having the tools and information readily available to you will remove one barrier to success as you navigate your processes for working together. So some background information. Some of you may be familiar with our first toolkit, which was in 2009, and this toolkit is or was available on both of our coalition websites as one large, about 250-page PDF document. And so one of the reasons that we're updating the toolkit is to make it more user-friendly. So you'll see that each section of the toolkit has a link to that specific document and topic, so you don't have to wade through the whole document to find what you're looking for. Also, just because, you know, it had been 7 years now, so as you all know, there are constantly changes in this field, and so it really needed content updating and kind of a facelift. Another big change, I will say, from this toolkit as opposed to the 2009 one is that you'll notice that we don't have really agenda topics available per se. The old toolkit had a lot of agenda topics with ideas for who to invite and kind of resources that were associated with those topics. And one reason for that is, I think, what I've come to know and learn about CCR teams is that they don't necessarily need to know what to talk about as much as they need to know how to talk to each other to reach a common ground. And so this toolkit really focuses more on the how.
All right, so next we'd like to just poll and see who we have joining us today. So if you could, Peter's setting up right now for the polling. If you could let us know which discipline you're with, and if your discipline is not listed there, then if you could type in the chat box which discipline that you belong to, or if you're a community member. So just go ahead and type that in the chat box, and we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. All right, so it looks like we have about 57% advocacy, 7% law enforcement, 7% sane or medical, and 29% other. A couple of people have typed in. We have somebody from the coalition, which is Peter, and then somebody from probation and parole. If there's others, please feel free to type in the chat box at any time to let us know who's joining us today.
So moving on to the first section of the toolkit, which is called Laying the Groundwork. In this section, you'll find the key foundational concepts and theories to generate a common understanding of domestic violence, sexual assault, and the multidisciplinary efforts to address both. So one of the things that also was not included in the 2009 toolkit we noticed was just some basic definitions of domestic violence and sexual assault. And that was one thing that we wanted to really include up front in this toolkit so people had that information. And the reason for that is that it's really important that teams are working with a common definition when talking about intimate partner violence versus domestic violence. You know, the statutory definition is different than the, you know, what we know as the pattern of coercive control and kind of the advocacy definition. So you'll notice in this section that there's kind of the definition, some relevant statistics, forms of domestic violence, as well as some barriers to leaving. And one idea for application for this section of the toolkit is to have each member review the domestic violence or sexual assault dynamics section, and then potentially facilitate a focused conversation to debrief from the information that you learned in those sections. And you'll learn later on about the focused conversation method. So the sexual assault dynamics page or link on the toolkit is essentially the same thing, talking about the definition of sexual assault, the different forms of sexual assault, and statistics, both national and statewide. Then another sort of laying the groundwork and information that needs to be conveyed is about what a CCR is generally. So the next section talks about an overview of CCRs, including the history. It can be helpful for teams to know that, you know, this isn't just a group that came out of the ether, that it really was developed, you know, now over 30 years ago in Wisconsin. And so being able to connect with the history of CCRs and kind of how they evolved over time might be important for teams to know. Then CCR membership, so it talks about some relevant members of a CCR team, and it also talks about how, again, kind of historically, CCRs were really organized around the criminal legal system and how they've kind of evolved over time, and our understanding of them has broadened to include other relevant community partners that are interfacing with victims and perpetrators of domestic violence and sexual assault. And then finally, this section includes broad goals of a CCR. So it's talking about ensuring a victim-centered response to violence and access to community resources, focusing on offender and the understanding that lack of focus on the offender might be exactly what the offender needs to keep offending. Ensuring diverse populations have a voice and access to culturally appropriate responses, and promoting a collective position that domestic violence and sexual assault are community issues. So it requires really buy-in from the entire community to create an environment of intolerance for these crimes. Next, we provide a brief overview of SART. We don't go much into it as much as the CCR, obviously, because this is the CCR toolkit, but we're really wanting people to understand kind of the differences between a SART and CCR. So in this section, you'll find information about the 4 key disciplines that make up a SART team, which are advocacy, law enforcement, SANE, and prosecution. The role of a SART is also discussed, including building relationships between the disciplines, identifying community resources, and sharing information to avoid duplication of services. And again, the differences between CCRs and SARTs are identified, including the size of the team, which is a much smaller focus, as I kind of just mentioned, the performance of a case review, and having the focus on the criminal justice system and really that survivor's experience navigating the criminal justice response.
Okay, so next we have another polling question to ask, which is, if you're part of a CCR team currently, let us know if it's a DV CCR, an SA CCR, or if it's dual, or if there's another type, if you maybe are working with a human trafficking CCR, or and just let us know what that other is. All right, so it looks like for those of you that are on the webinar today that 14% of you are part of a DV CCR, 43% are part of an SA CCR, and 43% are also part of a dual CCR addressing both domestic violence and sexual assault.
And we asked this question leading into the next topic area, which is successfully addressing sexual assault and domestic violence in a CCR. And noting that in the responses here, there's quite a few of you that are participating in dual domestic violence and sexual assault CCRs. So this section includes some of the benefits of doing so, which for especially those of you in rural areas, there can be the same people kind of coming to the meetings about domestic violence and sexual assault. So benefits of combining into a dual CCR include that, you know, there's less people to go around, so less people to staff meetings. Combining resources, so when domestic violence and sexual assault are addressed in the same team, you have resources from both areas being contributed into the team. Some of the concerns about addressing both in a CCR, sexual assault tends to take the back seat, with most teams focusing on domestic violence. I know that I've heard that come up across communities in the state, and it can be a real challenge. So this section provides some information on how to meaningfully integrate sexual assault into what might be a domestic violence dominated team. And then there are additional sort of ideas for how to be successful navigating both sexual assault and domestic violence in a multidisciplinary team. So moving on to kind of the next section, which is establishing a CCR team. This section provides considerations about ways to structure a team, including member recruitment and engagement, leadership roles, and meeting formats. So the first section is about community readiness, and it covers these 5 areas that you see on your screen. We discuss in this section how to assess and understand the readiness of a community to create a CCR. So talking about the community perception of sexual assault and or domestic violence, looking at the resources available to victims, looking at data collection and what to look for in data collection and how to analyze the trends within your individual jurisdiction. And then we talk about, with the data, kind of next steps to decide what we should do with what we've learned with analyzing our data and how to move forward. The next topic in this area is successful collaborations. So this is from the Accessing Safety Initiative, and I know this was also included in the original 2009 Toolkit, so it has very important information that is still relevant today, and it provides an overview in the section of a lot of what is expanded upon more in the CCR activities section. So you'll find kind of an overview of the importance of creating a mission statement, goals and objectives, and a work plan. It talks about clearly defined roles and responsibility, including leadership roles, learning about the cultures of agencies in your multidisciplinary team, and developing and strengthening interorganizational relationships, and emphasizing that this is really important for the sustainability of the team. Oftentimes what happens is people leave a team and they might have been a really active participant, but the relationship doesn't go beyond that person, so it's not infused within their organization. Their involvement in the collaborative effort kind of goes away when that person leaves their job. So really looking into more about how we can sustain teams that are successful. This also talks about decision-making strategies and a conflict resolution protocol, also important considerations to have in place when you're establishing a CCR. The next section is talking about levels of multidisciplinary team development. So I look at this kind of as an informal assessment of sorts, that you can look at these areas and kind of assess where your team is operating. So networking, just a quick overview of these three concepts, is simply exchanging information for a mutual benefit. So this is what I think every CCR team in the state does, is some form of networking. You might get together and provide agency updates. You might provide updates on policies and procedures within your organization. But you're not really going more beyond that. So a lot of teams are doing networking successfully because that's kind of the easiest thing to do. Then kind of moving along a continuum then to cooperation, which is not only exchanging the information about your work, but also modifying activities and sharing resources for mutual benefit. So I think a lot about how many CCR teams in the state will cooperate on awareness events, for example, where they're cooperating to put the event on. They may be contributing resources and time and personnel to be at the event and staff the event. So it builds upon sort of the exchanges that happen in networking, but adds the new component of kind of sharing the resources. And then finally, we have collaboration. So this is building upon networking and cooperation. And this is kind of the end goal, or what a lot of teams strive to do. So ultimately, working towards a collaborative relationship is the goal, but there are values in the other components as well. And if you can look at this information and kind of assess where your team falls on this continuum, you can, discover where you need to strengthen your work together.
Great. So our next polling question is in regards to subcommittees, and it's just a yes or no. We'd like to know how many of you that are on the call that currently have CCR teams have subcommittees within your CCR. It looks like about 38% responded yes to having subcommittees, and 63% do not currently have subcommittees.
Again, this is kind of a lead into our next topic area, which is about CCR Team Structures. This section of the toolkit has information about these three common ways that teams around the state have structured themselves. And the first one being a subcommittee model. So you have kind of the larger, broader CCR team, and then underneath that you have sort of special interest subcommittees. I am more familiar with the one in Dane County because I was a part of a subcommittee here. So they have members of the subcommittees that attend the larger CCR. They have leaders of each subcommittee, and then they send representatives to the full CCR meeting. So the benefits of that is that some team members might be interested in different areas. One of the subcommittees that I sat on here in Dane County was the Abuser Treatment and Monitoring Subcommittee. And so, I was a part of that subcommittee, but we had a representative that kind of took our work that we were doing in that subcommittee and shared it with the larger CCR, and they were our conduit from the larger CCR to our subcommittee. So that's the subcommittee model. Of the complete team participation, I think this is probably the most common that I see and hear about around the state, which is simply where everybody on the team participates on the larger CCR. And benefits of that, of course, there's more buy-in because everybody is a part and has a voice in making or contributing to the goals. But the downfalls of that are that less work can be accomplished because, of course, you're having more input from a larger number of people that can kind of slow down the process. However, understanding that in rural areas, again, there might not be enough people to sit on different subcommittees, and so participating as a full team might be kind of the only option. Another potential team model is the breakout team model. So this would be where teams come together for maybe 2 hours a month. The first 30 minutes are spent as a large group. The next hour, potentially, you break out into your subcommittee within that same meeting. And then the last 30 minutes, you would come together again as a large group and kind of talk about, what you worked on or discussed within your subcommittee breakout. So this can be beneficial for people that want to work on specific topic areas but don't want to attend, or can't attend due to a variety of reasons, multiple meetings per month. So looking at ways to structure your team can help address some of the issues that commonly come up and cause people to kind of lose interest in teams or disengage. So these three models can be for consideration when you're structuring your team. Following that topic area, we have team member engagement. So this is a one-page document that talks about the different types of members and how they can play a part on the team. So we have regular members, ad hoc members, subcommittee members, and specialty-focused members. Regular members, those who regularly attend the meetings. Ad hoc members, those may be brought in for a specific project or purpose that the group is working on. And then subcommittee members, the members of those smaller subcommittees of the larger CCR. And then specialty-focused members. So some communities have CCRs that have maybe 1 or 2 meetings a year where they invite all of the judges or all of the law enforcement chiefs, and so those meetings would be really focused on those topic areas and those members coming in for that special meeting. Next, we talk about leadership roles and responsibilities for CCR teams. So like many teams or organizations that you might be a part of, CCRs also have leadership roles and responsibilities. So this section talks about roles of the chair, a co-chair, communications chair or secretary, treasurer, and subcommittee chairs. The next section is member recruitment, and this was also included in the initial 2009 edition of the Toolkit. So there are a couple of different approaches that you can take to recruiting members, starting with a core group. So thinking about the people that are most passionate about the issue, kind of the natural leaders in your community when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault, and building your team around that core group. Or the other approach is sending a broad invitation to community partners, so any people that are interfacing with domestic violence and sexual assault victims and perpetrators, sending a broad invitation, telling in that invitation about what the group is aiming to accomplish, and hoping that they can join and bring their perspective to the table. So it covers the two approaches, and then also includes a sample invitation that you can customize to invite people to be a member of your team. Next, we have meeting format and agenda. So these are some of the basic things to consider for running a CCR meeting. We have meeting logistics, so thinking about time, location. Some teams that are their counties are geographically spread out. They choose to rotate the meeting location, and they found that that increases attendance. So some of the meeting logistics to consider, like location, having refreshments, things like that. Meeting format, so some possible agenda formats, having a part of the agenda be about networking or having a roundtable discussion, providing updates, and having maybe an educational component, for example, bringing in a guest speaker, and then working on maybe CCR business, so talking about what's going on in subcommittees and checking in on goal attainment and things like that. I will also say that this is where you can find a list of possible agenda items. So while we're not including a specific section on agenda items, you can find a list of possible topics if you're looking for things to potentially discuss. So moving on to the next section of the toolkit, we're moving into the CCR team activities. So this section includes suggested activities and action ideas that your team may choose to pursue.
All right, so we have another polling question for you, which is, do you feel that your team uses a trauma-informed approach? And your options are not at all, sometimes, usually, and all of the time. Looks like we have responses of 46% of you feel that your team sometimes uses a trauma-informed approach, and 54% of you feel that your team usually uses a trauma-informed approach.
So there are no people identifying being on the extreme ends of the spectrum, so that's good.
Yeah.
So the next section is talking about facilitation and participation with a trauma-informed framework and making this a practice within your CCR team. So it discusses how having a trauma-informed framework within your team benefits the victims you're serving as well as benefits the team. It also can assist you in understanding dynamics of the team and members of your team. So one thing that I wrote about in there is, if you can think about potentially a law enforcement officer who just responded to a horrific domestic violence call, and then they come right from that call to the team meeting, for example. Of course, the experience of, just recently leaving that traumatic domestic violence call is going to impact the way that officer shows up to the meeting. So that's just one example, but really having that trauma-informed framework and understanding that, everybody comes to the table with different things that have happened in their day, different potentially traumatic events that they've experienced professionally or even personally. So the benefits of having a firm grasp of trauma-informed care within your team. This section also provides you with a couple of links to two webinars on trauma-informed care, specifically the neurobiology of trauma. So those would be some tangible things that you could, again, potentially share with your team members and then facilitate a focused conversation to debrief about the learnings from those resources. The next section is about data collection and analysis. So this gives a listing of suggested data to be collected that is relevant to domestic violence and sexual assault to help your team better assess the trends within your jurisdiction. There's also in this section a suggested activity for your team to utilize and a sample chart of data. So it gives you kind of an idea of what relevant data you might want to look at in your community and an activity to engage with that data within your team. This section is about community mapping. This is a process that can be useful to jumpstart a CCR that has been stagnant or for a newly developed team to begin defining how they will work together. This is an exercise that aims to clarify the roles and responsibilities of each agency, identify a continuum of services that is needed for people who've experienced domestic violence and sexual assault, clarify the process for how agencies make referrals to each other or identify gaps if this is not happening, and clearly identify the strengths, challenges, gaps, and opportunities that exist in communities for people who've experienced domestic violence and or sexual assault. This section includes examples of community mapping documents from communities that we facilitated this process for. So this includes a domestic violence and sexual assault scenario for community mapping. The mapping process itself is based on a scenario, and then we ask each entity around the table to walk through their steps of how they process through that case. So this section contains the scenario for mapping, some ground rules, a law enforcement map, so a sample map from a community that we worked with, as well as a sample list of strengths, challenges, gaps, and opportunities. And from this, if you choose to facilitate this process within your team, you can take what's the information that's gleaned from that activity and transform it into goals and objectives and a work plan for your team. The next section is about focused conversations. So a focused conversation is an excellent way to provide structure to conversations that might otherwise travel all over the map. And I know I've heard from facilitators of CCR teams that this is a challenge that they've experienced, conversations that just kind of really go all over the place and don't have a direction. So the method involves asking questions of the objective level, reflective level, interpretive level, and decisional level. And this is in shorthand referred to as ORID. And in the context of CCR work, again, this method can be useful for debriefing after presentations or events involving your team. So if you have a guest speaker coming in to share information about community resources or providing cross-training, a focused conversation can help draw out the importance of these experiences and orient the team towards action. And this section also includes examples of questions that you could use to facilitate a focused conversation. Moving on to tips for writing goals and objectives. This section gives teams a tangible tool to utilize when setting goals and defining objectives of those goals. It discusses the differences between goals and objectives and how to create SMART objectives. It provides a great resource on action words to use when setting goals and objectives. So again, this is a one-page document, front and back, that you can print out and use if your team is setting goals, and it can provide some guidance to that process. The next section is about development of mission and vision statements. Again, this is something that we just kind of cleaned up from the 2009 version. This was included in that version of the toolkit. This section defines what mission and vision statements are. So mission statements being the guide for the operations of a multidisciplinary team, highlighting the beliefs and values of the team, and vision statements reflecting the end goal if the mission statement or the mission was ultimately achieved. Vision statements can be helpful for teams to build consensus on how they view the future and where the progression of their work together will lead. The toolkit section poses some discussion questions that could help guide a discussion for developing a mission and vision statement within your team. And we also include some sample mission and vision statements in this section. This section is about creating a Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU, which is an agreement about the relationship between agencies and defines the parameters and expectations between them. So this toolkit section describes what to consider when designing an MOU and provides some sample MOUs that you can take a look at. Establishing accessible and culturally appropriate systems interventions. We included this section because CCRs get in the habit of discussing issues from a mainstream lens and are not identifying ways to adapt resources to meet the realities of victims from marginalized communities. So this is kind of a concise overview of what culture and cultural competence might look like, and specifically within CCRs, how culture shapes the individual's experience of the violence, whether perpetrators accept responsibility for violence, whether the services available in your community are equally accessible to all, and culture shapes our own responses within the systems and organizations in which we work. So again, our response to victims of trauma needs to take into consideration their various cultural identities in order to achieve the intended result that we're aiming to accomplish by coming together and developing new solutions within our CCRs. So a term, again, that I put up on the slide is cultural competence, which suggests that there's a set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that can be developed over time in order to work with those who may be from a different culture from ourselves. We also talk in this section about language accessibility, which has tips for working with interpreters, and we include also resources for cultural competency and accessibility, including links to some interpreting services in Wisconsin. The next section is about CCR meeting survey questions. So this can be helpful for assessing where team members feel the team is at and operating at with regard to these 4 areas. Mission and purpose, development and practice, structure and sustainability. So checking in via survey with your team periodically can be important to ensure that your team is on the right track. So this section provides a list of pertinent questions that you might ask in a survey about these 4 topic areas. The last topic before we get into our state and national resources is about focus groups. This section includes how focus groups can be used to identify victims and service providers' needs and concerns, seeking input from a variety of stakeholders to identify gaps, strengths in services, programming, and collaborative efforts. And it can contribute to the development of a work plan that identifies and builds upon strengths while identifying gaps and ways to fill them. This section provides logistics and tips for leading focus groups, suggested questions to ask within a focus group related to domestic violence and sexual assault, and then talks about some skills for facilitating a focus group. So we're on to our last section, which provides links to local resources as well as national CCR technical assistance projects, and offers a wide variety of webinars and other online archived resources. So I'll just list some of the resources, which include our website, so End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin, WCASA, the Wisconsin Department of Justice, the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence, Stop Violence Against Women, and there are several other multidisciplinary or CCR-related resources that are highlighted in this resource sheet as well.
So we'd like to open it up for any questions or comments that any of you have. I know this is a brief webinar. We just wanted to give each of you kind of a sneak peek into what to expect from the toolkit. And again, what we'll be doing is we'll be sending this out, the archived webinar, along with the link to the toolkit. So you will have that later today. But we wanted to open it up for any questions or comments, and Peter's going to tell you how to do that.
So if you find the raise your hand symbol, and if you raise your hand, we can unmute you. Otherwise, you can type your question into the questions pane.
If you think of something, or if you want to maybe ask something offline, go ahead, feel free to give Sara a call. Or maybe you don't want to call me today, but feel free to email us as well. We wanted to just make sure that everyone had an opportunity, if they had something that was burning, to be able to ask that. I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to say a special thank you to my colleague Sara for taking the brunt of this work this morning to roll this out verbally to all of you. And here's our contact information. If you have anything that you would like to ask, or if you want to know how you can access the toolkit, again, Peter will be sending that out. But if you have any issues with that, let us know. And we just want to say thank you for taking time this morning.
And our contact information also, once you look at the toolkit, and if there's any ideas that you're having or questions that you have about how to apply what's in the toolkit, feel free to contact either of us. We'd be happy to talk through some ideas for how to apply these concepts.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day and happy holidays.